I barely talked to my brother because his wife spread lies about me and he never apologized. My brother and I were very close. In childhood, we shared almost everything: games, secrets, and laughter. We had always been a constant support for each other. However, as the years went by, differences began to surface. In fact, before all of this, my relationship with him seemed solid, almost as if nothing could tear us apart. I lived with him and his family during the pandemic. It was a challenging time for everyone, but despite the tensions, we stayed together. My wife and I got married at 38, which is relatively late compared to my siblings, who had married much younger. My wife, with the warmth that defines her, invited my sister-in-law to be the maid of honor at our wedding. She offered her a special place at such a significant moment for us. Also, my sister-in-law stayed with us during the weekend of the bachelorette party, which initially seemed like a perfect opportunity to strengthen our relationship. However, from the start, things weren't as simple as they seemed. Before the bachelorette weekend, my sister-in-law insisted on speaking with my wife. She claimed that, being the only married woman in the family, she wanted to warn her about the strangeness of the family. Although I had already told my wife about everything she might encounter, my sister-in-law insisted on having that conversation. After that talk, my wife began to behave strangely. She was distant and didn't want to visit my brother's family. I didn't understand why, but I felt something was happening, even though I didn't know exactly what. Shortly before the wedding, the first serious tensions began. My wife and my sister-in-law had disagreements about the bridesmaids' dresses. The request was simple: the dress should be golden, and my wife had to approve it before purchase. However, the constant pressure from my sister-in-law, continuously sending dresses for approval, stressed my wife out. Despite her attempts to be understanding, the situation grew increasingly tense. A week before the wedding, I received a message from my brother saying that my sister-in-law had already found a dress, but there was no photo for my wife to approve. I replied with a message that, although direct, was not meant to be aggressive. I'm glad my sister-in-law found a dress, but we need to see it at least 4 days before the wedding, or she won't walk, though she'll still be invited to the wedding. My brother got very upset by this message, accusing me of being excessively aggressive, and demanded that I apologize to my sister-in-law. Surprisingly, he forbade me from speaking to his wife and children until I apologized. This was the first blow that left me stunned. Why, if my comment was completely reasonable, should I apologize? The situation became increasingly tense, and although I tried to avoid conflict, the discomfort took over. Shortly after, on our honeymoon, I discovered that my sister-in-law had told my wife that I was a drug addict. To put things into perspective, I have never had addiction issues. The reality is that occasionally I consume an edible, maybe once a month or every 2 months. My wife has always known this, and there was never any secret about it. But my sister-in-law apparently decided to lie to her. When I confronted her, my brother asked me to call my wife a liar, something I couldn't do under any circumstances. Although my brother initially acknowledged that his wife had made those statements, he later denied that she had said such a thing, which made it clear to me that he was trying to manipulate the situation in his favor. The situation worsened when we went on a trip with the family. My wife tried to approach my brother to give him a hug, but he rejected her abruptly. It was a hurtful act that my wife tried to understand, but she found it very hard to process. The tension grew even more when we decided not to eat with them, something my brother took as a personal affront. Even though my family supported me, my brother was still upset, demanding that we include my wife in our activities. Amid all this, I found out that my sister-in-law had started spreading lies about my wife. She claimed that my wife had rejected up to 9 bridesmaids' dresses that had been chosen. When I found out about this, I couldn't stay silent. I showed the text messages proving that my sister-in-law was lying, and made it clear that my wife had never rejected those dresses. Not only was my sister-in-law lying, but she was also poisoning the relationship between my wife and the rest of the family. This wasn't just unfair, it was hurting someone who wasn't only my wife, but someone who had tried to integrate into my family in the best way possible. I demanded an apology from my brother and my sister-in-law for the lies they had spread, but instead, he told me that if I kept pushing for an apology, we should never speak again. So, instead of giving in, I decided to set boundaries. I didn't want to talk to them until they acknowledged their mistake. Now, the rest of the family is divided. Some think I should let it go, but the truth is that I can't allow them to keep manipulating the situation like this. My brother keeps changing his version of events to suit his convenience, and that makes me trust him even less. The lies are piling up, and I feel I can't trust someone who changes their story at will. The relationship with my family has become tense. My brother has isolated himself, and I've made it clear that I can't keep allowing myself to be treated this way. The situation has put me in a difficult position because on one hand I want to preserve family peace, but on the other hand, I can't stay silent when I'm being disrespected. The emotional manipulation I've experienced hasn't been easy to handle, and I'm becoming more firm in my decision to stand my ground. My parents and other family members seem to see things differently, and while some support me, others urge me to simply let the situation go. The problem is that as the tension grows, I realize that giving in would be a way of admitting that the lies are okay. I'm not willing to do that. And even though my family may think otherwise, I'm clear that I can't let the truth be distorted. My brother and I were very close, but now, I don't know if I'll ever be able to regain that relationship. The words have already been said, the lies were spread, and the damage has been done. Time will tell if we can find a solution, but for now, communication is broken. The weight of the manipulation and lies has left me with a feeling of bewilderment and distrust. I don't know what will happen, but I'm determined to stand firm in what I believe is right. After everything became complicated with my brother, the following weeks were a bundle of unresolved tensions. I tried to stay calm, but every time someone mentioned something about the family or the situation with my brother, I couldn't help but feel like I was sinking in a sea of frustration and distrust. Although I tried to focus on my life, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The memories of the last time we spoke kept haunting my mind. My brother angry, my sister-in-law defaming my wife. Over the weeks, I tried to approach other family members, seeking their support or at least some understanding. My parents, who had always been a constant presence in my life, seemed to be in the middle of all this. They didn't take sides openly, but I could feel their discomfort every time we spoke. My parents tried to keep the peace, but sometimes they seemed more concerned with superficial stability than with the truth. There were moments when I thought that maybe the solution was to distance myself even more, to distance myself from the family, from the problems, and simply live my life in peace. But I knew I couldn't. I couldn't ignore what was happening, nor the lies that were being spread about my wife. As the days went by, the discomfort in the air was palpable. Every conversation, every family gathering seemed filled with an unbearable tension. I tried to talk to my wife about the situation, but she was also at her limit. At times, I felt trapped between my love for her and the desire for my brother to acknowledge what was going on. I had asked him to apologize, to do the right thing, but the distance kept growing. My calls and messages to his wife were ignored. What had once seemed like a close relationship with my brother had transformed into an abyss of communication breakdown. The rupture wasn't immediate, but gradual, and it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. Amid this emotional storm, I had to make difficult decisions. My wife began to speak more openly about what she had experienced with my sister-in-law. Every time she shared a piece of what had happened, it seemed to make it harder for her to remain kind to her. The lies my sister-in-law had spread about her could no longer be ignored. Somehow, my wife was being unfairly labeled as someone difficult, when all she had done was be honest and respectful. Throughout, I couldn't stay silent in the face of injustice. I decided to speak with my family, but instead of seeking a solution, every time I brought up the topic, the words became more empty, more hollow. No one seemed willing to take a clear stance, and I felt that, instead of resolving the situation, it was only getting worse. My brother kept holding on to his version, and every time I tried to speak, I found myself facing a wall of silence or evasions. The truth, in this case, seemed to be the victim, and I was losing control of the situation. One day, during a family meeting, something changed. My mother, who had always been a figure that united everyone, finally broke the silence. Her comment, which she initially thought would be an attempt to reconcile everyone, ended up triggering something much deeper. She said she thought we were all being too harsh with the situation and that we should try to see things from another perspective. But that only increased the tension. Seeing how my brother began to lash out at my wife, in some way, her. After that meeting, I decided not to attend any more family gatherings. I had reached my limit. Every time I saw my brother or my sister-in-law, I found myself in a constant battle between what I felt and what the situation required me to do. I tried to communicate with some of my other siblings, but the responses were vague. It seemed like everyone wanted to avoid the conflict, and that avoidance only made things harder. No one wanted to take a clear stance. No one wanted to face the lies that were being told. The weight of the lies began to suffocate me. My brother had said things that not only affected my relationship with him, but also with the family as a whole. Everything I had tried to build with my wife and I as a couple was now being undermined. I had lost trust in the people I thought would always be there for me. My wife, despite her pain and everything she had endured, stayed by my side, which gave me strength, but also made me feel like the situation was beyond my hand. My brother had crossed a line, and although I tried to rationalize everything that had happened, I realized I couldn't keep ignoring what he had done. He had betrayed our relationship, not just by lying, but by denying the reality of what had happened. The emotional manipulation he was imposing on me, along with the lies about my wife, had become intolerable. However, I didn't want to give up completely. I didn't want to give in to the situation. I couldn't stand by while my family, my wife, as always, supported me, but I could see how all of this was affecting her. The situation had not only worn her down emotionally, but it had also begun to affect her health. The tension between us and the family had become unbearable. She continued to be the center of lies, and I couldn't stand seeing her feel responsible for something she hadn't even caused. As everything progressed, I felt that my family no longer saw me the same way. The things we used to share no longer pay. It's in moments like these when one begins to question the true nature of family relationships. Is it possible to keep loving the people who have hurt us? Is it possible to forgive when the lies have been so evident? I was lost between my love for my family and my desire to protect the person I loved. I felt that I couldn't keep walking this tightrope, but I also knew I couldn't give up. Deep down, I knew that the answers wouldn't be easy to find. What had started as a small spark of distrust had become a fire that was consuming everything in its path. And in the meantime, my brother continued to avoid responsibility. My sister-in-law kept up her campaign of lies, and I kept searching for a way to find some peace amid the storm. The situation between my brother and me remained an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Even though I had tried to avoid direct confrontations, the tensions never seemed to lessen. Every time I encountered a family member, I felt there was an air of discomfort, as if everyone had aligned themselves with a version of events that didn't reflect reality. Every attempt to talk about what had happened only generated more unease, and no matter what I said, my brother. In every conversation I tried to have with my family, I faced the same wall of evasions. My parents, with their love and care, tried to make everything go back to normal. But the truth was that something much deeper was at play: distrust. It wasn't just a dispute between two people. The whole family nucleus was affected. The lies my sister-in-law had spread like poison, corrupting the relationships between us. Meanwhile, my brother. At first, I thought that time and distance would calm things down, but I realized that silence only made everything worse. My brother and his wife held on to their stance, unwilling to acknowledge their mistakes. It wasn't just the lie about the bridesmaid dress that had distanced us. It was the accumulation of small things that had been adding up. My sister-in-law, with her malicious comments and constant manipulation, had completely worn out the relationship with my wife continued to be the target of criticism. It pained me to see her like this, knowing that all she had done was try to fit into a family that didn't seem to want to accept her. Even though she had always been kind and open, the false accusations about her behavior began to sink deep into her. It wasn't just a matter of lies. It was a matter of respect, of not being listened to or understood. She had been sincere in her dealings with my family, and all she got in return was. What hurt me the most was that, even now, my brother continued to defend his wife, ignoring the truth and protecting the lies she had spread. In every conversation I had with him, I realized there was no room for the truth, no room for reconciliation. My brother had become someone unrecognizable, someone who, in his desire to protect his wife, had lost sight of what really mattered: family. I remember one of the last times we spoke. My brother told me that I had to let the situation go, that I should forgive and move on. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't forgive the lie. I couldn't forgive the harm that had been caused to my wife. At that moment, I realized that it wasn't just about him or her. It was about what I was willing to accept. I couldn't keep allowing my brother and his wife to manipulate the situation in this way. As the days passed, the situation worsened. My wife no longer wanted to attend family gatherings, not out of lack of desire, but because she knew that every time she did, she would encounter more lies. Every meeting with my brother and his wife became more uncomfortable, and every word they said only deepened the wound that already existed. The last time we tried to gather with them, the tension was so thick that even the most superficial conversations couldn't alleviate it. The presence of my family began to notice. Although they didn't say anything directly, there were looks of complicity, whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. The division was more evident than ever. On one side, there were those who thought I should let it go, that I should be the one to take the first step toward reconciliation. On the other, there were those who understood that the lies and manipulation couldn't go unpunished. The conflict wasn't just with my brother, but with the way. Amid all this, I began to question myself. Had I done the right thing? Was I being too inflexible? Or was I defending my wife as I should? Every time I asked myself these questions, the answer remained the same. I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't allow my family to crumble under the weight of the lies. Regardless of what others thought, regardless of what they said, my duty was to protect my wife, protect our relationship. My brother, however, continued with his stance of not giving in. Every time I tried to talk about what had happened, he would steer the conversation away or act as if nothing had occurred. His lack of acknowledgement frustrated me deeply. Every time he said that things should be resolved without more, I couldn't help but feel that he was taking me for a fool, as if the problems he had caused could disappear just by stopping talking about them. The situation was emotionally draining me. The pain of seeing my wife suffer for something she hadn't done, the weight of the lies still hanging in the air, was consuming me. Sometimes I thought that maybe the best thing would be to cut ties with everything, let it all fall apart, and live in peace without the constant tension. But then I thought about what that would really mean. Losing my brother, my sister-in-law, my family. Everything we had built over the years would disintegrate in an instant. I didn't know. My thoughts were growing darker. The internal struggle was constant, and every time I thought about what I had lost, I felt like my world was crumbling. I wanted to see a path to a solution, but I couldn't find it. All I saw was a dead-end street, with walls covered in resentment and lies. The rift between my brother and me was deepening, and I found myself trapped in a spiral of emotions I didn't know how to control. The anguish of the situation was leaving me without strength. Every time I thought about what had happened, I felt as if I were losing a battle I never wanted to fight. But, on the other hand, I knew I couldn't give up. I couldn't let my brother get away with it. I couldn't allow the truth to be buried under a mountain of lies. As the days passed, I realized that my brother and I were no longer the same people. The relationship we had in the past, the one that seemed invincible, was now crumbling little by little. Every time I thought about what had happened, I felt more lost. The family, the one that had been my refuge, was now a battlefield where lies and manipulations intertwined, making everything even more complicated. My brother continued with his stubborn attitude. Still, there was something about the way he handled the situation that was becoming increasingly unbearable. I had gotten used to conversations with him being sincere, but now every word he said seemed to be filled with falsehood. My brother, who had always been a figure of authority in my life, had chosen not to see the truth. His stance was clear. He preferred to protect his wife and his version of events than face reality. For my part, I could no longer keep ignoring what had happened. I couldn't allow my wife to be treated that way, to be accused of something she hadn't done, just because my sister-in-law decided to manipulate the story in her favor. I knew my loyalty had to be with my wife, but I also faced the difficult decision of whether to maintain my relationship with my brother or let it go completely. The truth was, it hurt to think that I might reach a point where I would have to choose between my brother. Despite everything, I struggled to accept that the lies that had been woven could not be easily undone. My sister-in-law had been so persuasive that many family members started to doubt my wife, without listening to her side of the story. It was frustrating to see everything crumble under the weight of the lies. My sister-in-law, with her comments and need to be the center of attention, had created a web of misinformation that complicated the situation even further. My wife was starting to feel trapped. She no longer wanted to attend family gatherings not just because of the lies, but because of the palpable tension that could be felt at every encounter. I completely understood her. I couldn't blame her for feeling rejected and despised. I had seen her fight to be accepted, to try to integrate, but every time she tried, it seemed like the doors closed even more. The situation was deeply affecting her, and my own helplessness was eating me up inside. My thoughts often centered on what my brother would have done if the situation were reversed. If it had been his wife who had been attacked with lies and defamation, would he have acted the same way? Would he have defended the truth, or would he have allowed the lies to continue without doing anything? The doubt gnawed at me. I couldn't help but think that if my brother had the same level of empathy and loyalty that I did, the situation would have been completely different. But I couldn't keep living under that weight. I knew that if I wanted to protect my relationship with my wife, I would have to make a decision. I couldn't keep allowing my brother to treat me as if I were the one at fault for everything. His passive attitude, the way he avoided facing the truth, was consuming me. It was as if every time I spoke with him, I was speaking with someone I didn't recognize. The person who used to be my brother no longer existed. He had changed, and I wasn't sure if. The situation had reached a critical point, and I felt trapped. I couldn't go back, but I also didn't want to continue in a constant war. There were days when I thought the best thing would be to distance myself even more, cut all ties, and let everything resolve without my intervention. But at the same time, I knew that wasn't what I really wanted. I didn't want to lose my brother, even though it was becoming harder and harder to admit. But at the same time, my wife needed me too. The worst part of all this was the uncertainty. Not knowing if things would improve, not knowing if time would change the perspectives. My brother had proven time and time again that he was unwilling to acknowledge his mistake, to apologize for the lies. Instead, he had hidden behind his pride and the idea that, by protecting his wife, everything else should take a back seat. But in that process, he was losing the most important thing, family. It was incredible how one lie, no matter how small, could destroy so much. Everything that had happened seemed to be based on misunderstandings, lack of communication, and, above all, the unwillingness of some to recognize the truth. My sister-in-law, who had caused all of this, seemed to be moving on with her life as if nothing had happened, while my wife and I were the ones suffering the consequences. Sometimes, I wondered if things would ever go back to how they were before, if we would ever be a united family again. But the truth was that I no longer knew if I wanted that to happen. There were so many open wounds, so many lies that couldn't be erased, that it was becoming harder and harder to see a way out. My brother had made his decision, and I had to make mine. I couldn't keep waiting for someone else to resolve the conflict, because I was the only one who had the power to change things. My emotions were a whirlwind. On one hand, I wanted to reconcile, to seek peace, but on the other, I felt betrayed, as if everything I had done for my brother and his family meant nothing. The conversations I had had with him were like trying to talk to a wall. There was no dialogue, no understanding anymore. Everything had become an ego game, and the truth was somewhere lost between the lies and excuses that kept coming out of his mouth. The situation, instead of calming down, seemed to grow more tense. Family gatherings were no longer what they used to be. The atmosphere was charged with furtive glances, interrupted conversations, and an uncomfortable silence that seemed to envelop us all. Each of us carried our own emotional burden, and I didn't know how much longer we could endure it. I didn't want to keep living like this, but I also felt incapable of changing the circumstances. Everything seemed out of control. In the end, the dilemma was the same. Should I take the first step and yield to restore peace, or should I stand firm and protect my wife once and for all? Each option seemed to have its own consequences, and I didn't know which one was the right one. The weeks went by, and with each passing day, the situation became harder to handle. There were moments when I felt like I was trapped in an endless spiral, unable to get out. Every attempt to get closer to my brother seemed to fail, and as time went on, I drifted further away from the family that had once been my refuge. What hurt the most was my brother's indifference, that distant attitude that made me feel invisible, the excuses he kept. The emptiness inside me grew, and the rage began to consume my thoughts. I couldn't understand how, despite trying to be the best brother possible, I found myself in the middle of a conflict I hadn't started, but was seemingly paying for with every part of my being. My brother, who had always been a strong figure in my life, now seemed like a shadow of what he once was. I couldn't trust him anymore, and the damage caused by the lies was still present in every interaction. Family gatherings, instead of being moments of unity, had turned into battlefields where glances were avoided and conversations were superficial, without depth. I knew my brother didn't want to face the truth anymore, but I couldn't help thinking that, somehow, I was also losing something important. Was all of this worth it? Was there any future for the relationship we once had? Or was this the end of a chapter one thought would never close? My wife, for her part, continued to struggle with the weight of the lies. Every time I saw her pain, I felt more helpless. Despite her strength, she was also suffering the consequences of a family that wasn't willing to acknowledge what had really happened. The injustice of it all filled me with anger, but at the same time, I felt trapped. I didn't know how to handle the situation without losing everything. The constant emotional pressure was pushing me to my limit. Sometimes, when I was alone with my thoughts, I wondered if there was anything I could do to change the dynamic. I had tried to speak calmly to my brother, to make him see the situation from another angle, but every time I did, he shut down even more. His attitude was inflexible, as if he had made an irreversible decision. This made me feel like the battle was already lost, but I didn't want to give up so easily. Something inside me told me that if the truth was that things weren't improving, and the lies continued to emerge in every conversation I had with other family members. My sister-in-law, in her eagerness to manipulate the situation in her favor, had created an atmosphere where no one wanted to be honest. It was as if words had become weapons, and every time someone spoke, it felt like a fight to impose their version of events. My wife, being at the center of it all, seemed to be the most affected. The worst part was that the more I tried to defend my wife, the more I found myself distancing from my brother. Even though his wife had been the cause of it all, my brother kept protecting her, and I felt like I was fighting against an unstoppable current. There were times when I wished I didn't have to take sides, didn't have to choose between my family and my wife, but the reality was that I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't allow the lies about my wife to continue circulating without. The conflict began to affect everything around me. My friends, who once saw me as a stable and secure person, started to notice the change in me. The tension was evident, and they often found me lost in my thoughts. The constant internal struggle, not knowing what to do, was consuming me. Sometimes I felt that the solution was simply to leave it all behind, to distance myself from the family. But that thought terrified me. Could I live without them? Was that really what I wanted? My wife offered me her support, but I couldn't help seeing how she was becoming more and more worn out. I knew I was fighting for her, but at the same time, I felt something inside me was breaking. The love I felt for my family, that connection that had been so strong, now seemed like a distant memory. Every time I thought about my brother and what he had done, I felt more distant from him. The relationship we had no longer existed, and the worst part was that I didn't know how to rebuild it. The days passed, and the tensions kept increasing. Family was no longer a safe place, but an emotional battlefield where everyone found themselves trapped. I didn't know how to handle my feelings. On one hand, I wanted to protect my wife, defend her from the lies that had been told about her. But on the other hand, I also felt that losing my brother meant losing an important part of myself. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have been if things had been different. My mother, who had always been the pillar of our family, was starting to notice the deterioration. Although she didn't say anything directly, her eyes reflected the sadness we were all feeling. She didn't know how to say the words I needed to hear, but her silences spoke louder than 1,000 words. The situation hurt her as much as it hurt me, but she also knew that, although the family tried to keep up the facade, things could never go back to the way they were. Lies and pride had gotten in the way. The emotional exhaustion was overwhelming. Every time I thought about the situation, I felt more drained. The attempts to fix things only seemed to make the problem worse, and the distance between my brother and me kept growing. There were times when I wondered if I would ever find a way to reconcile with him. But as time passed, it became clearer that the situation wasn't going to resolve itself. Something would have to change, but I didn't know if I would be able to take the decisive step. After so much time dealing with lies and family tensions, I felt that I had reached a point where I could no longer move forward without making a definitive decision. The battle I had fought, both internally and externally, seemed endless. But something inside me told me I couldn't keep dragging the weight of uncertainty. My sister-in-law's lies, my brother's indifference, and my wife's suffering had led me to a dead end, and I had to. It was a peaceful day, one of those when time seems to stand still, when I decided it was time to take a step. I couldn't keep living in emotional limbo, not knowing what to do with my life and my family. The pieces of the puzzle, which once seemed to fit perfectly, were now scattered and broken. There was no more room for doubt, only for action. The first thing I did was sit down with my wife. After everything we had been through together, I knew she deserved to know what I was thinking. We had been in this fight together, side by side, but it was necessary to lay everything out on the table. I looked into her eyes, searching for the trust that had always been there, and explained my thoughts. I couldn't keep fighting for a relationship that wasn't willing to acknowledge the truth, for a family that didn't want to listen. My brother had made his decision. I apologized to my wife for not making the decision sooner. All this time, I had dragged her into a conflict that wasn't hers. Although I understood her pain, she had stood by me all along, and I realized that the biggest mistake I had made was not putting an end to it earlier. I couldn't keep going over a situation that had no solution. When I finally decided to cut ties with my brother, I did it with a heavy heart, but also with the certainty that it was the best thing for both of us. I knew that, by making this decision, there would be no turning back. I called my brother, after such a long time without speaking, and told him how I felt. I explained I could no longer allow the lies to keep ruining our lives. I asked him to take responsibility for what he had done, but I knew it wasn't going to happen. What happened next was a cold, distant conversation. My brother didn't show even a hint of remorse. His words were like knives, and his refusal to admit his fault only strengthened my decision. During that talk, I felt as though my brother wasn't there anymore, as if the person I had grown up with had vanished. The conclusion was painful but clear. The relationship I had known no longer existed. The words were bitter, and the promises of change were empty. That day, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I decided to cut ties with my brother, not because I hated him, but because I could no longer allow his pride and lack of empathy to keep affecting my life. My wife needed support, and I needed to free my heart from that weight. I had made the hardest decision of all, but the peace I felt after freeing myself from that conflict was indescribable. After speaking with him, I felt a deep emptiness. Despite knowing that I had done the right thing, it was hard to accept that things would never be the same. The relationship with my brother had been irreparably broken, and I couldn't look back. As I sat in silence next to my wife, I realized that what I had lost was irreversible, but I also understood that, at the same time, what I had gained was invaluable. My inner peace and the certainty that I was doing what was best for. At first, my wife didn't know what to think. She had witnessed the tension, but the fact that I had finally made that decision surprised her. It wasn't something she expected, but at the same time, she understood. She knew that I couldn't keep living under the weight of guilt and lies. She looked into my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I saw tranquility in her gaze. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I had finally made a decision that allowed us to move forward. The family, of course, didn't understand. Many were surprised. Some even tried to intercede, to find a solution that could never exist. But it didn't matter. I had already made my decision, and there was no turning back. The fact that my brother never apologized, that he never acknowledged what he had done, no longer mattered to me. The truth was clear, and I had chosen my path. In the following days, life continued. There were moments of loneliness, moments when the absence of my brother felt overwhelming. But there were also moments of liberation. Finally, I could focus on what truly mattered: my family, my wife, and the life we had built together. I had learned a valuable lesson about family bonds and how sometimes it is necessary to sever those bonds in order to heal. Over time, my relationship with other family members also changed. Some distanced themselves, while others tried to understand. But in the end, I understood that life goes on, with or without the approval of others. What really matters is what we decide for ourselves. And I had chosen peace. I had lost my brother, but I had gained something much more important, the ability to be true to what I really believed, regardless of the consequences. Years later, the wound left by the breakup was still there, but it didn't hurt as much. It had healed, not by the passage of time, but because I had finally taken control of my life and had let go of what I couldn't change. My family, although different, was still important, and the most important thing of all was that, in the end, I was at peace with myself. My wife and I moved forward with the certainty that we had done what we had to do, and that, despite everything, we had the future ahead of us.